The courtroom was filled with the usual hum of activity, a normal day in a Midwestern city courthouse, where cases of all kinds were heard and resolved. Judge Thomas Hill sat at the bench with his usual air of authority, his demeanor serious and professional, but with an underlying sense of distance. He had seen it all, or so he thought. As the case of a speeding violation was called before him, Angela Carter entered the room, her steps confident, her attire sharp and poised. She moved with grace, but something about her presence immediately caught the attention of the room. Her black suit and well-maintained appearance stood in contrast to the ordinary defendants who appeared before Judge Hill on a daily basis. Her calm demeanor only served to highlight her apparent self-assuredness, which didn't go unnoticed by the judge. Judge Hill glanced at the docket again, scanning the name Angela Carter. His mind flickered for a moment, trying to place it, but nothing came to him. He had no reason to suspect anything unusual about this case. After all, traffic violations were routine. The defendant was another person breaking the law and seeking to avoid the consequences of their actions. He motioned for her to speak as she stood in front of him with her hands clasped behind her back, her posture straight and respectful, yet there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself. Her voice was clear as she explained that she had been late for a work meeting and had accidentally exceeded the speed limit. She spoke with reason and calmness, but Judge Hill was already forming his opinion in his mind. He was used to people trying to explain their way out of responsibility. It was a common tactic, and one he didn't entertain for long. Angela continued her explanation, making eye contact with him. As she spoke, her words were not filled with excuses, but with an understanding of her mistake. She wasn't trying to avoid responsibility. She simply wanted a chance to explain herself and perhaps receive a reduced fine for what she had considered a momentary lapse in judgment. But Judge Hill didn't seem to listen as closely as he should have. He glanced at the paperwork in front of him. The violation was clear. She had broken the law, and that was all that mattered to him at that moment. His eyes didn't linger on her face or her words. He had already decided on the penalty, a fine that would be significant enough to ensure compliance, but not so severe as to be crippling. Without much fanfare or pause, Judge Hill made his decision. He informed Angela that the fine would be imposed and that there would be no leniency granted. He gave her no room for further discussion, no second chance for a deeper understanding. His tone was final, his gaze unyielding as he handed down the decision. Without a second thought, Angela remained silent and accepted the ruling. She nodded respectfully and turned to leave the courtroom without protest. She was used to being treated this way by people who didn't know her or understand her background. She had faced similar moments in her career and life, but each time it weighed on her a little more. She wasn't just another defendant. She was someone who had worked hard to earn her place in the legal world. She was a judge herself. But today she was treated like a simple person caught in a traffic violation without any recognition of the woman she had become. Angela stepped out of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors. As she made her way down the hall, her thoughts were calm, but her mind was racing. She had been fined for something as trivial as a speeding ticket, but it wasn't the fine that bothered her. It was the way she had been treated, the way she had been dismissed as just another defendant, a person with no significance in the eyes of the judge. She wasn't surprised. She had seen this type of behavior before in her career, but it still stung. She had worked so hard to get to where she was today, to earn the respect she had in her field, to be recognized as an equal by her peers. But in that moment, in that courtroom, she felt invisible, just another black woman in a world that often overlooked her accomplishments and reduced her to her appearance. She didn't let her frustration show as she exited the courthouse, walking down the steps with her head held high. As always, she was used to keeping her emotions in check. No one needed to know what was going on inside her. She had been through enough to understand that showing weakness was never an option, especially in a field dominated by people who had already made assumptions about her simply because of her race and gender. Angela had faced discrimination throughout her career, but she had also proven time and time again that she was capable, that she was just as skilled and knowledgeable as any of her colleagues. But today, in front of Judge Hill, she had been treated like any other person who broke the law, as if her years of hard work and dedication meant nothing in that moment. She had been reduced to nothing more than a ticket and a fine. As she drove home, her thoughts kept circling back to the same question. Why had it happened again? Why had she been treated this way? She had encountered prejudice before, but it was always something that lingered in the background, something she learned to navigate without ever letting it define her. But today, it had felt different. It had felt personal. She knew she couldn't let it slide. She had to say something. She had to make him understand. But she also knew that speaking up would only make things more complicated. The system wasn't built for people like her, and she had learned the hard way that calling out injustice could sometimes make things worse. But something inside her refused to stay silent. Something inside her knew that it was time for change. Meanwhile, Judge Hill sat at his desk, staring at the case file, trying to move past the day's proceedings, but something kept tugging at the back of his mind. Angela Carter, her name, wouldn't leave him. His mind kept returning to it over and over again as he flipped through the pages, trying to find something, anything that would help him shake the nagging feeling in his chest. But it was no use. The name Angela Carter kept coming up in his thoughts. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized he recognized it from somewhere. He had seen her name before, but where it wasn't just the name that bothered him, it was the feeling that something was wrong, something had gone unnoticed, something important had slipped through the cracks. He had dismissed her so easily during the hearing, so confidently, without truly considering who she was or what she represented. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake, but he didn't know how or why. Judge Hill sat back in his chair, rubbing his temple as he stared at the stack of files before him. His mind wasn't focused on the legal documents in front of him, but rather on Angela Carter. The more he thought about the brief interaction they had in the courtroom, the more uncomfortable he became. He had dismissed her too easily, he realized. The way she had spoken, calm, composed, professional, it had felt like she was someone important. Someone who knew the law as well as he did, if not better. Yet he hadn't given her that recognition. Instead, he had handed down a fine as though she were just another ordinary defendant trying to get away with breaking the law. His fingers drummed against the desk, a sign of his growing unease. Judge Hill wasn't the type to second-guess his decisions. He was known for his certainty and his firm stance on the law. But something about the way Angela had held herself, the quiet strength she projected, made him feel like he had missed something crucial. Was it simply because she was a black woman that he had been so quick to disregard her? He felt an uncomfortable tightening in his chest as that thought lingered. Had his judgment been clouded by unconscious bias? The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that he had acted hastily, and not just because he had imposed a fine. It wasn't the fine itself that troubled him. It was how he had treated her. She hadn't asked for special treatment. She had simply been trying to explain herself. But in his rush to move on to the next case, he hadn't bothered to listen. In his mind, she had been just another person in a long line of offenders. But she wasn't just anyone. His assistant Nancy knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "Judge Hill, there's something you might want to see," she said, stepping into the office with a printout in hand. He looked up at her, momentarily distracted from his internal turmoil. "What is it?" he asked, trying to appear calm, despite the unease he felt. Nancy handed him the printout. "I looked up Angela Carter's name. It seems she's not just a defendant. She's a sitting judge in Maryland. She's been practicing law for over 20 years and has received numerous accolades for her work in the judiciary." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He couldn't believe it. He had found another judge, a colleague, and not just any colleague, but a woman who had accomplished far more than he had. Angela Carter wasn't just a random defendant. She was a peer, a fellow judge with decades of experience. Judge Hill sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. How had he missed that? How had he been so blind? The realization began to set in, and with it came a wave of shame. He had assumed she was just another person trying to avoid accountability. But in reality, she had more legal knowledge and experience than most of the people who stood before him in that very courtroom. He had judged her without ever truly seeing her for who she was. Worse still, he had treated her like someone who was unworthy of respect. He leaned forward in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The guilt was overwhelming. He had made a mistake, a big one, and it wasn't just about the fine. It was about the way he had viewed her, the assumptions he had made based on nothing more than her appearance. He had let his own biases guide him, and now the consequences of that judgment were clear. Judge Hill sat frozen in his chair, staring at the printout of Angela Carter's impressive career. The words seemed to blur together as they registered in his mind. He had found a colleague, someone who had spent years working in the very same field as he had, someone who understood the law inside and out, perhaps even better than he did. How had he missed it? How had he failed to see her for who she truly was? The office felt small and suffocating as he reread the document. Angela Carter had been a judge for over 2 decades in Maryland, renowned for her work in criminal justice reform. She had been honored with awards, written scholarly articles, and even served as a mentor to young lawyers and judges. She was a trailblazer, a role model, someone who had dedicated her life to the law. And yet in that moment, Judge Hill had treated her like just another defendant, a nameless face, someone who had committed a simple violation. The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how wrong he had been. The decision had been so automatic, so dismissive. He had assumed that because she was a black woman, she couldn't possibly be someone of stature or authority. He had made assumptions based on the color of her skin and her gender, and it had clouded his judgment. He had acted out of a deep, unconscious bias, one that he had never fully confronted until now. His mind raced as he considered the implications. He had humiliated someone who was not only his peer, but a fellow professional in the judicial system. He had failed to extend her the respect that she deserved. He felt a mix of anger at himself and profound embarrassment. But more than anything, there was a deep sense of regret. He had always prided himself on being impartial, on applying the law fairly. But in this case, he had let personal prejudices shape his decision, and the consequences were far-reaching. Judge Hill knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this go. He had to fix it, but he had no idea how. The idea of confronting Angela Carter, apologizing for his mistake, seemed almost impossible. What could he possibly say to make things right? How could he explain that his actions, however unintentional, had been rooted in a bias he hadn't even realized existed? The guilt gnawed at him as the minutes ticked by. He needed to take action. He couldn't just pretend this didn't happen or hope it would fade away. His failure to see Angela for who she truly was a problem much larger than one isolated case. It was a reflection of a much deeper issue within the judicial system and society at large, an issue of racial and gender bias that had been allowed to persist unchecked. With a sigh, Judge Hill reached for the phone, his hand trembling slightly as he dialed Angela's number. His stomach twisted in knots as it rang, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, her voice came through on the other end, calm and professional as always. "Hello, this is Judge Carter." "Judge Carter," he began, his voice low but steady. "This is Judge Hill from the courthouse. I need to speak with you about something that happened earlier today." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a slight hesitation. "Go ahead," she said softly. "I made a mistake," Judge Hill confessed, feeling the weight of the words as they left his mouth. "A big one. I didn't realize who you were when you were before me in court today, and I treated you unfairly. I need to apologize." The silence on the other end of the line felt endless, stretching out far beyond what seemed reasonable. Judge Hill held his breath, waiting for a response, unsure of what to expect. Had he completely ruined any chance of reconciliation, or was there some way to make amends? His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his mistake hanging heavy in the air between them. Finally, Angela's voice broke the silence, calm but firm. "I appreciate your apology, Judge Hill," she said, each word measured careful. "But you should know it's not just about the fine. It's about how you treated me, how you saw me, or didn't see me, as the case may be." Her words hit him harder than he anticipated. He had been expecting anger, perhaps even resentment. What he hadn't expected was her quiet strength, the way she spoke not from a place of defensiveness, but from one of knowing, of experience. She wasn't just speaking for herself in that moment. She was speaking for all the women of color who had been overlooked, dismissed, or judged based on preconceived notions. "I'm sorry," Judge Hill repeated, his voice quieter now, filled with the weight of understanding. I acted in haste, and I see now that I was wrong. I didn't give you the respect you deserved, and I didn't see you as an equal. And that's a failure I can't undo." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I want to learn from this. I don't want this to be just another mistake that fades away without change." Angela was quiet for a moment, and Judge Hill held his breath, wondering if his words had fallen short. Had he done enough to convey the sincerity he felt? Was it too late to make things right? "You know," Angela said finally, her tone softening, "it's not about one bad judgment, Judge Hill. It's about something much bigger. It's about the ways in which the system often devalues people like me, people who look like me, people who have to work twice as hard to earn the same recognition and respect as those who are already in positions of power. It's about the everyday microaggressions, the assumptions, the biases that are so deeply ingrained in this system that it's hard to even recognize them when they happen." Her words resonated deeply within him. Judge Hill felt as if the floor had been pulled out from under him. He had never truly understood the weight of what Angela was describing, the layers of oppression that women of color in the legal system had to face daily. He had never been forced to confront his own blind spots, the ways in which his privilege had shielded him from seeing the world through their eyes. "I get that now," he said, a sense of humility settling over him. "I had no idea. I didn't see what I was doing, but I want to do better. I want to listen, really listen, and not just in this moment, but moving forward. I don't want to be part of the problem anymore." Angela sighed softly, as though weighing his words. "It's not going to be easy, Judge Hill. You can't just fix this with a phone call. But your willingness to recognize it, to understand that there's work to be done, that's a start." He felt a wave of gratitude flood through him, though he knew it wasn't enough to erase the damage done. But for the first time, Judge Hill felt as though he was beginning to see the truth of the system he had been a part of for so long. He wasn't just a judge in a courtroom, he was a part of a larger machine, one that was broken and in need of repair. "I'll do the work," he promised, "and I'll start by reaching out to those who have experienced what you've been through, listening to their stories. I won't just talk about change. I'll be a part of it." Angela's tone was still steady, but there was a note of cautious optimism in her voice. "I hope so, Judge Hill. For all our sakes, I hope so." The conversation ended with a sense of tentative understanding between them. Judge Hill felt the weight of the call long after it had ended. He stared out the window of his office, the city's skyline a blur in the distance. Angela's words echoed in his mind, each one a reminder of the deep-rooted issues that shaped his profession and the world around him. It was no longer just about one mistake he had made. It was about the larger systemic failures that perpetuated inequality and injustice. For the first time, Judge Hill began to truly examine his own biases. He thought back to his past decisions, the cases he had presided over, the way he had interacted with defendants and colleagues alike. He had always prided himself on being impartial, but was he truly? Or had his own experiences, his own position of privilege, shielded him from seeing the full picture? Had he dismissed other voices, other perspectives, without even realizing it? That evening, Judge Hill sat down to review his cases. He looked over old files, read through transcripts, and reflected on the people who had stood before him in his courtroom. He saw faces that had been overlooked, people who had been given minimal sentences, or worse, not given the benefit of the doubt. He hadn't seen their struggles, hadn't recognized their humanity as clearly as he had his own. It was a sobering realization. The next morning, he arrived at the courthouse early, determined to start making changes, even if they were small at first. His first task was to meet with his assistant Nancy and ask for help in setting up meetings with colleagues who could offer perspectives on racial and gender bias in the judicial system. He reached out to local organizations, to groups that had worked for years to raise awareness of inequality in the legal field. Judge Hill knew that he couldn't change the system overnight, but he was ready to start somewhere, to be part of the solution. Weeks passed, and the process of learning, of confronting his own privilege, became more challenging than Judge Hill had anticipated. He attended seminars and training sessions, listening to the stories of those who had been impacted by the system he had spent his life upholding. Each session left him feeling uncomfortable, but he didn't shy away from it. He forced himself to face the uncomfortable truths, even when it was hard to hear. Angela, in the meantime, had continued her work as a judge in Maryland. The two hadn't spoken again since that phone call, but she had heard about his efforts to confront his biases and his outreach to others in the legal community. She didn't expect instant change from him, but she appreciated that he was trying. For her, that was a start. She had seen too many people in power dismiss the need for true reflection, too many who were content with surface-level apologies and empty promises. One afternoon, a month after their initial conversation, Judge Hill reached out to Angela again. This time, it wasn't to apologize, but to ask for advice. He wanted her input on how best to continue his journey of growth, how to hold himself accountable in the face of institutional challenges. Angela agreed to meet him. She had heard of the changes he was making, and while she still had reservations, she was willing to give him the chance to prove that his commitment to change was real. They agreed to meet in person, a meeting that would mark the beginning of a new chapter, not just in their professional lives, but in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. The day of the meeting arrived, and Judge Hill felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. He had come a long way since his conversation with Angela, but he knew there was still so much more to learn. The reality of the systemic issues that plagued the judicial system weighed heavily on him, but now he felt a sense of responsibility to make tangible changes. This meeting with Angela was another step forward, an opportunity to listen, to understand, and to gain further insight into how to be an ally in this fight for equality and justice. He arrived at the small cafe near the courthouse early, wanting to prepare himself for the conversation ahead. He had been thinking about what he wanted to say to Angela, how he could show that he was sincere in his desire to grow and do better. When she walked in, he stood to greet her, and for the first time since their phone conversation, he saw her not just as a colleague, but as someone who had been through battles he could never fully understand. Angela smiled slightly as they shook hands, a sign of mutual respect, but also cautious optimism. She sat down across from him, her posture relaxed but attentive. "Judge Hill," she said, her voice still steady but with an edge of curiosity, "I'm glad you wanted to meet." "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, choosing his words carefully, "and I know I still have a long way to go. But I'm here to listen to you. I want to understand how I can do better, how I can contribute to real change in this system." Angela took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. "You're asking the right questions. That's a start," she said, her voice calm but filled with the weight of years of experience. "But it's not just about listening. It's about taking responsibility, about being accountable for the power you hold." Judge Hill nodded, fully aware of the privilege and authority he had in his position. He had spent his entire career in the courtroom, met with many defendants, and handed down countless decisions, but never before had he fully acknowledged the power dynamics at play. He had been blind to how his position could affect the lives of those who appeared before him, especially people like Angela, people who had to work twice as hard just to be seen as equals. "I understand that," Judge Hill said, his voice steady, "and I've been thinking a lot about the power I have in the courtroom. I can't change the system overnight, but I know I have a responsibility to use my position to create space for voices that have been silenced for too long. People like you." Angela's gaze softened slightly. She had heard many promises before, but something in his tone made her believe that this time might be different. "It's not enough to just say the right words, Judge Hill. People are watching. The system is watching. And more importantly, the people who've been affected by the system are watching." He met her gaze, understanding the weight of her words. "I know. That's why I'm committed to doing the work. It's not just about feeling guilty or sorry for what I've done in the past. It's about creating a path forward, not just for me, but for others who need to see change." Angela took a sip of her coffee, considering his words carefully. The real test will be in how you handle it when things get difficult. When the pushback comes, when people question your motives. It's easy to talk about change when everything is calm. But when the system fights back, that's when you'll know if you're truly committed to justice. Judge Hill felt a chill at her words. He knew she was right. The work ahead of him wasn't going to be easy. He would face resistance, even from his own colleagues, those who had built their careers in a system that benefited them. But it was a challenge he was ready to take on. For the first time, he understood that real change would come not through simple acts of goodwill, but through consistent, difficult actions that would require him to challenge not only the system, but his own assumptions. "I'm ready for it," he said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm willing to fight for what's right, and I'll do it for as long as it takes." Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then let's make sure that fight isn't just for us, but for the people who need it the most." In the weeks that followed their meeting, Judge Hill became increasingly aware of the challenges that lay ahead. His determination to implement real change was tested daily. He began by addressing his own courtroom practices, ensuring that he was listening more attentively to every person who stood before him. He started attending regular diversity and inclusion workshops, speaking openly about his own biases and the need for reform in the judicial system. But as Angela had warned him, the real test came when the pressure mounted and when his efforts were questioned. One morning, during a case involving a young black man charged with a nonviolent crime, Hill found himself at odds with some of his colleagues. The defense attorney argued for leniency, pointing out the systemic inequities that had led the young man to this point. Hill, in the past, would have been quick to dismiss such arguments, relying solely on the law and his own perceptions of guilt. But now he found himself truly listening, considering the context of the defendant's life, his upbringing, and the societal pressures he had faced. After the defense finished presenting its case, Hill glanced around the courtroom. Some of his fellow judges exchanged skeptical glances, their expressions hardened by years of tradition and experience. One judge in particular, Judge Stevens, leaned forward. "Judge Hill," he began, his voice laced with condescension, "are we really going to start considering social factors over the law? This isn't a charity. It's a courtroom." Hill could feel the tension in the room. The pressure to conform, to stick to the traditional methods of judgment, was palpable. His mind raced, but he remained calm, his voice steady as he spoke. "I understand the law, Judge Stevens, but the law must reflect the society it governs. If we don't recognize the systemic factors that contribute to crime, we are failing both the law and the people it is meant to protect. We can't ignore the larger picture." The room grew silent. Judge Stevens seemed ready to protest further, but Hill held his ground. He had come to understand, through his conversations with Angela and his own self-reflection, that real justice required more than just blind adherence to legal precedents. It required compassion, understanding, and a recognition of the ways in which society's inequalities shaped the lives of those who entered the courtroom. The other judges exchanged looks, some nodding, others remaining quiet. In the end, Hill made the decision to grant the defendant a reduced sentence, offering him a chance at rehabilitation rather than simply punishment. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental to Hill. He knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but in that moment, he felt a sense of clarity. That afternoon, Judge Hill called Angela. He needed her advice again, but more importantly, he wanted her to know that his commitment to change was more than just words. She answered on the second ring. "Angela," Hill said, his voice filled with gratitude, "I did it. I made the decision today. I took a stand for what's right. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't popular, but I feel like I'm finally on the right path." Angela's response was quiet but sincere. "I'm proud of you, Judge Hill. Change doesn't happen overnight, but today you made a difference. Don't let anyone discourage you from this work. It's going to take time, but if you stay the course, you'll make an impact." Hill smiled, feeling the weight of her words. "Thank you for believing in me. I'll keep pushing. I know I still have so much to learn, but I'm not turning back." As he hung up the phone, Judge Hill looked out over the city once more. He had a long road ahead of him, and he knew that the real work was just beginning. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that he was truly serving justice, not just the law, but the people who needed it most.